This morning, official confirmation was received. Russian units have fully established control over the settlement of Iskra. This was the culmination of a series of strikes on enemy positions that lasted for several days and ended with a rapid and powerful breakthrough. This success not only changed the situation in one of the key areas, but also threatened the entire line of defense of the armed forces of Ukraine in the region. Subscribe to stay up to date with all the events and receive truthful reports from the front. For many weeks before this moment, the positions had been relatively quiet. But in the depths, behind the line of advanced fortifications, intense and painstaking work was underway. Agent networks, deployed back in early spring, transmitted information about every movement of columns, about ammunition depots, about the rotation of personnel. This data was collected literally bit by bit and flowed into the intelligence departments, where analysts compared it with information from air and space reconnaissance. The most important task was to understand how the defense of Iskra was organized. It is a small settlement, but its importance went far beyond the geographical point. Roads leading to other enemy strongholds converged here, and the terrain created natural lines of defense. In addition, according to intelligence, there were equipped positions for artillery and anti-tank weapons in the vicinity, covering the approaches to larger settlements. Intelligence conducted surveillance from several directions. Drones recorded the location of equipment and fortifications, while ground teams worked in a high-risk zone under constant threat of detection. Any mistake could disrupt the operation, but the preparations were so thorough that every step was calculated. Even the start time of the attack was chosen, taking into account weather conditions, wind direction, and visibility for targeting equipment. At the same time the strike was being planned, staff officers considered various options, from a frontal attack to flanking maneuvers. The decision was made in favor of a combined approach. First, a massive strike of artillery and high-precision weapons against key strongholds, then the advance of assault units with armored support, and finally clearing the populated area and securing new positions. Coordination between units occupied a special place in the preparation. Units of different branches of the armed forces participated in the operation, each of which had its own task. Artillerymen had to suppress enemy firing points, tankers to break through fortified lines, infantry to consolidate and push out the remaining forces. At the same time, engineering units were already preparing in the rear to quickly restore roads and deploy logistics routes. An important stage was the aiming and adjustment of fire. When the artillery preparation began, the first salvos hit precisely the identified ammunition depots and artillery positions of the armed forces of Ukraine. A series of powerful explosions deprived the enemy of the opportunity to conduct aimed fire on the advancing columns. At this time, the spotters were in constant contact with command posts, transmitting coordinates and specifying the target of each subsequent strike. But the enemy did not sit idly by. There were reports of attempts at counterattacks, of the transfer of reserves from neighboring areas. However, the speed and synchronicity of the Russian units' actions left them no time to organize serious resistance. By the end of the first day, the main lines of defense around Iskra had been broken through. At this point, it became clear that the operation was developing faster than expected. Intelligence recorded a chaotic retreat of enemy units in the southwest direction. According to some reports, the abandoned positions were mined to delay the advance, but engineering groups worked quickly at the front, clearing passages for equipment and infantry. The first stage of the operation was over. Iskra was surrounded from several sides, and the enemy was half encircled. The decisive phase remained ahead, cleansing and complete consolidation of the Russian forces. The morning of the second day of the operation began with a dull rumble in the distance. It was heavy artillery, finishing off the remaining enemy firing points on the outskirts of Iskra. The air smelled of burning and gunpowder. The smoke from the night strikes had not yet cleared, hiding the outlines of the buildings. For the assault groups, this created both additional cover and risk. Visibility was limited, meaning every step had to be checked. The command decided to begin the assault from several directions simultaneously. Motorized rifle units entered from the east. Assault groups, supported by armored vehicles, entered from the north, and reconnaissance and sabotage units operated from the south, which were to cut off the enemy's possible escape routes. Everything was designed to deprive the Ukrainian units of the opportunity to regroup and consolidate in new locations. Tanks moved ahead, followed by infantry, using the walls of houses and destroyed buildings as cover. Every street turn, every yard could become an ambush. That is why fighters with experience in urban combat move forward. They knew how to work in conditions when the enemy could be behind any door or on the roof of the nearest house. The advance slowed down in one direction. Reconnaissance discovered a fortified defensive node, a former school building converted into a command post. The enemy concentrated the remaining forces here, set up heavy machine guns and grenade launcher positions. Fire support was requested via radio. A few minutes later, a precise mortar strike was launched at the building, after which the assault group burst inside. The resistance was fierce, but short. By midday, the command post was taken. Meanwhile, on the other flank, a sabotage group completed the task of cutting off the road leading from Iskra to the west. This completely cut off the escape routes. The remaining Ukrainian fighters were trapped. Attempts to break through in small numbers ended in vain. The density of fire from Russian positions did not allow them to even approach the exits from the settlement. By the end of the day, resistance in the center of Iskra began to weaken. Radio intercepts recorded enemy conversations about a shortage of ammunition and the impossibility of calling for reinforcements. Under these conditions, the command of the armed forces of Ukraine gave the order to retreat in small groups, abandoning equipment and some weapons. This decision, in essence, meant a complete admission of the loss of control over Iskra. The cleanup began immediately. Assault teams methodically combed block after block, checking basements, attics, and destroyed houses. Every room was inspected, every room was recorded in reports. The work was painstaking and time-consuming, but experience with such operations allowed the risks to be minimized. At the same time, engineering units began demining the territory. The enemy managed to plant landmines and tripwires in the most likely directions of movement. Portable demining complexes were used. Sappers worked in close cooperation with the soldiers, covering them from possible shots from the surviving buildings. By the evening of the second day, the flag of the Russian Federation was raised over the center of Iskra. This moment became a symbol of the end of the active phase of the operation. However, securing the positions and fully restoring control required several more days of work. There remained threats from enemy sabotage groups who could try to return to the settlement under the guise of local residents. The operation headquarters noted that the success of the assault was ensured by accurate reconnaissance, coordination between units, and rapid action on the ground. The losses were minimal compared to those expected, and the effect of capturing Iskra was significant. This point opened up opportunities for further advancement and created a threat of encirclement for the enemy's neighboring positions. That same evening, the first footage from the liberated settlement arrived. It showed destroyed buildings, abandoned equipment, and boxes of ammunition that Ukrainian units had not managed to evacuate. These images quickly spread across information channels, becoming clear evidence that Iskra had completely come under the control of Russian forces. The capture of Iskra was not just a local tactical success, but an event that significantly changed the operational situation along the entire front. Already in the first hours after the end of the active phase of the operation, details about the significance of this victory began to appear in Russian reports. Official representatives of the Russian Ministry of Defense emphasized that control over Iskra allowed to expand the buffer zone along the state border and ensure the security of several key supply routes. Military analysts noted that Iskra played the role of a nodal point in the defense system of the armed forces of Ukraine. With its loss, the enemy lost the ability to quickly transfer reserves and supplies along this route. Moreover, the neighboring direction where the defense could now be broken through much faster was under threat. In fact, the capture of Iskra created the conditions for the encirclement of a number of enemy positions in the adjacent areas. In Kyiv, official comments were restrained. Representatives of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine said that units had retreated to previously prepared positions, calling it a maneuver. However, statements by Ukrainian military experts and journalists in unofficial sources sounded different. There were increasingly frequent mentions of a chaotic retreat and the loss of significant amounts of weapons, including artillery and armored vehicles, which could not be evacuated under fire. In Moscow, this victory received wide coverage. State and independent war correspondents published materials directly from the scene, showing captured fortifications, ammunition depots, and abandoned equipment. The information space emphasized that the operation in Iskra was the result not only of military might, but also of the coordinated work of intelligence, headquarters, and units on the ground. The international reaction was also immediate. Several Western capitals expressed concern about the developments, as the fall of Iskra opened the way for further advancement of Russian forces deep into Ukraine's defensive lines. Some think tanks in the West noted that this success could affect the dynamics of the conflict, increasing pressure on Kyiv and forcing it to seek new formats for negotiations or military assistance. Meanwhile, in the border regions of Russia, the news of the capture of Iskra evoked a positive reaction. Residents who had long been under threat of shelling perceived this as a step toward reducing the danger. However, military sources warned that it was too early to relax. The enemy could try to carry out counterattacks or sabotage to destabilize the situation and compensate for the loss of a key point. Strategically, this success had another dimension. Control over Iskra allowed Russian troops to improve their positions for striking at enemy rear facilities. New sections of roads and communications were now under fire control, which complicated the supply of Ukrainian units in neighboring areas. This opened up the prospect of developing an offensive with fewer losses, since the enemy was forced to either spend forces on protecting vulnerable routes or withdraw troops, shortening the front. The analytical reports emphasized that the operation to capture Iskra became an example of how a combination of intelligence data, competent planning, and precise use of forces can lead to a quick and effective result. At the same time, caution was maintained in forecasts. Although the tactical success was obvious, the overall situation on the front remained tense, and both sides were preparing for new stages of military operations. Unofficial sources reported that as a result of the capture of Iskra, the Ukrainian armed forces lost not only equipment and weapons, but also a significant number of experienced fighters, who were either surrounded or forced to retreat in disarray. Losses of this kind are difficult to replace, especially in conditions of constant pressure at the front and limited resources. That evening, when the Russian flag was already flying over the administration building, the first reports from the scene were broadcast. Cameras recorded fighters checking basements and attics, sappers defusing mines, and columns of equipment entering the settlement. These images quickly spread across the world's media, becoming clear evidence that the operation had been a complete success. The capture of Iskra changed the operational balance of forces on the front, but the most important thing is that this success is now starting to work for the future. Analysts agree that the coming weeks will be critical for both sides. Russian troops have received the opportunity to develop an offensive in several directions at once, and the armed forces of Ukraine to urgently rebuild their defenses in order to prevent new breakthroughs. The first likely scenario that military experts are talking about is a deepening of the offensive towards key transport arteries. Control over Iskra allows the roads along which the enemy supplied the nearest strongholds to be kept under fire. If these routes are cut off, the Ukrainian armed forces will find themselves in a situation where supplies will only be possible via long and dangerous bypass routes. This will lead to a weakening of their combat capability and create conditions for new encirclements. The second scenario is to expand the buffer zone and gradually advance without major assaults. This approach reduces losses and makes it possible to gradually push the enemy out of occupied positions. This will require increased work by artillery and aviation, as well as constant impact on the enemy's logistics. This option is especially advantageous in the long term, as it allows for the conservation of resources and at the same time damage to Ukraine's defensive capabilities. The third scenario is a rapid breakthrough deep into the defense with the goal of encircling a larger settlement that has strategic importance. This option requires high speed and coordination of actions, as well as confidence that the rear is reliably protected. If this plan is implemented, the enemy may have serious difficulties in holding the front line in this entire area. The situation is extremely difficult for Kyiv. The loss of Iskra is not only the loss of a key defensive node, but also a blow to the morale of the troops. The Ukrainian command is already trying to stabilize the situation by transferring reserves and reinforcing neighboring areas. However, each such maneuver is associated with risk since resources are limited and the pressure on the front is growing. Moreover, the political consequences are obvious. Western partners are closely monitoring the developments, and such defeats can affect the pace and volume of military aid. The international reaction could go in two directions. On the one hand, Western countries could try to increase the supply of weapons and intelligence to compensate for Ukraine's losses. On the other hand, some capitals could begin to question the wisdom of continuing support at the previous level if the defensive lines are giving way so quickly. This factor is especially important against the backdrop of political discussions about negotiations and possible ceasefires. For Russia, the capture of Iskra is an opportunity to strengthen its position on the diplomatic front, demonstrating the ability to conduct successful operations with minimal losses increases arguments in negotiations. In addition, this success can be used in an information campaign to emphasize the effectiveness of the army's actions and weaken the enemy's confidence in its own strength. In the near future, we can expect that sabotage and reconnaissance groups of both sides will become more active on the front line. For the armed forces of Ukraine, the main task will be to destabilize the rear of the Russian troops, disrupt supplies, and delay the advance. For Russian units, it will be to consolidate, build a multi-level defense, and prepare to repel possible counterattacks. From a military point of view, control over Iskra has already begun to yield results. Cooperation between frontline units and rear services has been improved, supply routes have been established, and the fire control zone has been expanded. All of this creates the basis for future operations, which may be no less significant. Today, when the Russian flag flies over Iskra, this success is perceived not only as a victory in a single battle, but also as a step toward changing the entire configuration of the front. However, the military understands that there are new battles, new tasks, and new challenges ahead. The war does not stop, and every advantage gained must be consolidated and developed. We will continue to monitor the developments, analyze every step, and give you only verified information. Subscribe to be the first to know what is happening on the front and see the full picture of what is happening without distortion.